This is WPSL Port St. Lucie, the talk of the Treasure Coast.
Time now to ask the doctor, Rabbi Doctor, here on WPSL.
Thank you for that, Greg. And this is Rabbi Shafir Lobb. You're right, with a PhD, and I'm from Congregation Eitz Chayim in Port St. Lucie. And we were just talking before the show started that classes are about to get started at IRSC. The semester officially starts on Monday, the 19th. And yes, I'm teaching 4 classes this semester.
Very cool.
Yeah, I'm teaching in Port St. Lucie and in Stewart. I was going to be teaching up in Vero, but my boss swapped 2 classes. So
there you go.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit closer. So that's kind of nice.
Yeah.
And
so now how many students do you actually have in a class?
Typically between 40 and 50.
Wow.
So, well, that's nothing compared to, say Harvard, which, has a theater full of students.
Right.
And, you're lucky if one of the teaching assistants knows your name. Right. But in IRSC, we're actually challenged to know every student. I make out name cards for the students because, if I'm going to be learning 160 to 200 students per semester, I'm not that good with names. I'm very candid about that. I've never been good with names. I've tried every kind of mnemonic training thing, and it's not my forte.
I'm terrible with it.
I can do breeds of dogs, but don't ask me names of people. The standard joke when I was more active in the dogs was, this is Fido's mom. You knew which dog somebody was attached to.
It's funny you talk about class sizes. At Loyola UNLA, of course, that was back in the dark ages. The average class was like anywhere between 14 and 18 students. And I'll never forget going to UCLA for the freshman English to sit in. And it was at Pauley Pavilion.
Yeah.
There were 3,000 students in there. I'm thinking, my God.
Well, I remember freshman history sitting in what was bigger than McAlpin. And they were assigned seats, and I was in the back, and it was like, okay, so I'm going to sleep this semester. Yeah.
Wow.
And quizzes every Wednesday. I remember that still. Quizzes every Wednesday that I'm sure the TA graded and put in the grade book. And now students, it's wonderful. Students can check on their phones. They can get their grades live. You type in the grade and it shows up on their phone.
Oh, really?
So as I'm grading assignments, it shows up for the students immediately. And when it's posted at the end of the semester, it shows up live on their transcript virtually immediately.
Wow. Okay.
So, we live in a much more immediate information kind of world. And I'm going to be using some new technology in my class, which is actually using phones for the students to interact with the classroom. So we'll see how that goes. More coming on that. This is my first semester doing that. Yeah, I got challenged actually last night to do it, and I spent a good part of last night researching the software.
So I would think most profs would not want phones in the classrooms.
Well, and that's the idea of it, right? If you've got them working on classroom stuff, they're not playing games and texting.
Okay, yeah,
right?
Yeah, okay.
That's called, you can fight technology only so far, right? And I chuckled. Okay, truth confessions. I was sitting in the employee meeting yesterday, the adjuncts meeting, and there was a part of the presentation that just was not totally holding me. I could read what was on the screen faster than the guy could say it, and it was not Dr. Massey, but it was one of the other folks. And I whipped out the phone and I played a mindless game, right? So I can totally understand
True
this.
confessions.
Yeah, true confessions. So
leave it.
I'll leave it
let's
at that.
Leave it at that.
But I will tell you a couple other things about, IRSC. People really, really need to appreciate IRSC. I was talking with another colleague in another state, and they were saying to me, well, what other colleges are there in the area? And there's really not a lot right in the area. But on the other hand, there doesn't need to be, very candidly, because IRSC, now obviously there are many programs that they don't teach, but I think they're now up to 16 or 17 baccalaureates, several online programs, 13,000, something like that, full-time student equivalents, FTEs. They use FTEs like everybody else does. And, it's the number one college. It's the number one college. It just won the Aspen Award. Along with, I confess I forgot the other college that tied with them, Miami.
It's our rival,
That's our rival.
Miami-Dade.
Yeah, well,
that's okay.
That's why you don't hear a whole lot about it. But but still, even to be tied for first is incredible, right? And parents, here's a chance to get something that you never had a chance for, that your kids have a chance for, which is dual enrollment.
It's phenomenal.
Phenomenal. You can come out of high school with the first 2 years of college, an associate's degree, no college debt. IRSC has not had a tuition increase in 8 years. That's despite the money going down that they're getting from the state and the student load staying fairly constant. That translated into no raise for the professors this year, but that's life. Even if it had been a raise, it wouldn't have been.
I think a lot of colleges are, struggling with enrollment right now.
Of course.
And I don't care where they are in the United States. It's just a reality.
Right. No college wants to outprice this. That's a diminishing. That's like pricing your customers out. It doesn't make any sense for any business, and a college is there to stay viable, whether they're for profit or not for profit. They're still there to stay viable. Right. At the end of the year, the income has to at least approximate the outgo. And if you're doing it for a profit, then you're giving out dividends to your stockholders, and if you're not for profit, then you're reinvesting it back in the college. But it should be at least a little bit toward the positive. And they've got to keep an eye on that, because insurance is going up, benefits are going up, utilities continue to go up, and tuition is flat. So it's a challenge, and and the college is pouring money into buildings and reinvesting and continually upgrading software for the students, for the staff, for the faculty. It's an incredible. It's not a surprise that they won Aspen. And, Dr. Massey addressed all of us yesterday. Of course, he gives us the State of the College address. And we call it that. I don't know if he does, but we call it that.
It is. Yep.
And, one of the things that he said was that Aspen is not something that the college went out and looked for, but rather Aspen...
They came to us.
They come in when they see a college performing at a certain level. And that's really pretty cool, because one of the criteria is that students have to earn a higher than the average income for the area, which means that if you go to IRSC, you're going to be making more than half of the people in Port St. Lucie, which is not bad. There's a value in the education.
And it's interesting you mentioned dual enrollment. I mentioned this before as a young Floridian judge for over 20 years. I do the athletic, and all 7 of our kids were dual enrollment this year.
Yeah,
every single one, and it was just like amazing. And with volunteer hours of 300 or 400, it's like, oh my God, when do they sleep? It's amazing.
Yeah. It really is, and it's a great program. The class size of 40 to 50, and those are probably at the upper end, because most closes close at 40, and they have to ask the professor if they'll take more to go higher. And you've got to be able to interact, and certainly on a philosophy course which is paper intensive, translation professor grading intensive. You are mindful of how many students you have. But the students do get, I get to know the students. And
that's cool.
Yeah,
that's
really is.
Nice.
And I have to confess, this blew me away. One of my students from 2014, so 5 years ago, is going to med school. And,
Awesome.
and asked me if I would, they need a certain number of professor recommendations. Would I write them a professor recommendation, which I did. And when I sent him the email saying I have done it, so it was not to get me to do it. He came back and he said, I have to tell you that the way that you encouraged, coerced, forced, the way that you conducted, I think he was very diplomatic. The way you conducted the program of teaching us about other religions and having us experience them, he was in my world religion class, opened me up to other cultures and has truly made me pursue what I've pursued. And I was like, wow, so I obviously responded to that with, you just made my day.
That's your gee whiz moment.
Yeah, that's and I'm lucky enough to get some of those. And it makes up for the ones who call up and say, hi, I have 700 out of the 1,000 points. How come I don't have an A? There's a reason it's called 700 points. But I have 700 over 700. I should have an A. Yeah, that means you attempted 700 of the 1,000 points in the course. So please read your syllabus. P.S. Were you in class when we discuss this every day? Yeah, all those little things. So students are, always looking to see what they can arrange out of things.
But that is so cool, though, that you'd actually have someone come back and.
Yeah, I am really very lucky that way. The youth that I've worked with from the congregation, I still have contact with the young lady who was the very first celebrant of becoming a bat mitzvah when I was a student rabbi.
Oh my goodness!
And
wow.
She's married and teaching in Indiana, and so I do stay in touch with the students. I've got another one who's in sports and active in the Southwest, and I've got a couple that are going into different career fields. And so I'm aware of when they go to college and even when they graduate from college. So my kids tend to stay my kids, and that to me is a big part of why I rabbi and why I teach, right? Because it's not rocket science to know that I'm not 20 anymore. Those days are gone. I'm not going to be the one to physically change the world, but I can influence the people who will change the world.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And, and if I can make it a better world for everybody, then that'll fill me up. And it's students like that say, yes, I'm you broadened the W, the arms on my W for we. And I've started to realize that people are people. Yeah, it makes up for the occasional. And yes, I have had students who have said things like, "All women are liars," and not everybody's human. It's like, don't want to hear that. Cause,
all right, how do you handle that?
Well, it's free speech. They're allowed to say what they're going to say. However, it does not meet the rubrics for the course. Because we're not supposed to treat some people like they're not people. That's just, we're all equal under the law. Hello. Yeah, equal treatment. I believe we had an amendment to that effect because people weren't quite getting it.
It still aren't.
And still, well, and to be fair, when our founding fathers, men that they were, said that all men should be equal, they had a very different definition of man than we do today. Right? They really did mean gentry. They didn't mean males.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They didn't mean adult males, right? Because some men were boys and others were men. Some males were boys. Most of them, right? They really were out for the elite being equal. because in order to be a man, you had to be male, over 21, white, belong to the right church, and own an acre of land. So it wasn't even about being poor, because in town you would not own an acre of land, so you couldn't just have a townhouse. You had to have the townhouse and the country land in order to have that acre.
Oh, man.
Yeah, so it was a way of, yeah. But we've gotten, the idea was expressed, and we've come to understand it better, which is, one of the things that, so now I'm going to flip to my PhD, right? In my PhD, I actually quote Pope John, who said that he says the gospel has not changed, but we've come to understand it better. And that's true with spiritual scripture. It doesn't change. The scriptures stay. But when we understand it in light of all of God's creation, we understand it better.
But there's sure some strange interpretations of the scripture.
Oh, there's always going to be strange. Some people can interpret Alice in Wonderland strangely. Yeah. There's no... which is a perfect segue to go to another one. You didn't know you were going to do a segue for me, did you? Here's the segue. So this week is the week that we read the second edition of what are commonly called the 10 Commandments, or the 10 Utterances in Hebrew. Well, there's actually 2 versions of them, and they are slightly different. The one in Exodus, and this is the one in Deuteronomy, because now we're reading, traditionally Moses is credited with writing Deuteronomy.
And these were not written on Apple tablets, right?
They were not written on Apple tablets, despite the picture, that clearly has been published.
I love that picture.
That picture of Moses walking down with 2. It doesn't count the tablet he dropped either.
Oh my!
The other 5 that we'll never know. But so we're going to be reading that. And there's a couple of really interesting pieces in it that are traditionally translated, I'm going to say somewhat problematically. Okay? So there's one line in there that talks about the 3rd and 4th generation. And it's usually translated as, I will visit the sins of the fathers onto the 3rd and 4th generation, or something along those lines. And it's a strange usage of the word visit. But the implication is that if your parents sin, you're going to get punished. Now, let me move into the psychology part of the world and say all parents damage all children. All relationships damage each other and heal from it. And you continually do things and then hopefully grow and work through them. Okay, so now let's look at that text. What that text actually says is that I will take into account the sins of the parents up to the 3rd or 4th generation, and I will, for those that hate me, there's a whole lot of things that need to get explained in this phrase, and then I will be merciful to the 1000th generation for those that love me. Right, so we have this counterbalance of, I'm going to be aware of what your parents' issues were, because if you didn't have a good upbringing, you're already starting behind the power curve. And, God knows that. That's the idea of it, right? God knows that you've got a longer road to travel to get to where you should be. And you will, stumble and do all the human things along the way. And so it's not really, I'm going to punish you for it, as much as it is, I'm actually going to take into account, when I look at what you did, I'm going to consider what, might be going on, and take that into account. And so I will make it better. Or however we want to understand that. And you got 3 to 4 generations to break the chain, right? So if your parents were abusive, we know psychologically that the odds are greater that you will be in some way abusive to your children.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
You hear that. Yep.
Well, because you've learned that and you didn't learn a healthy response to stress, right? You learned a dysfunctional, non-constructive response to stress. And you're going to have to work at breaking that. And it might not be in that generation. It might take one more generation of people reaching out and interventions and help and realizing that life isn't great.
Which could be a grandchild.
Could be anything, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, right, so what the text is saying is God's going to take that into account and recognize that the child who comes out of the abusive home does not have the same privilege as the kid who comes out of a healthy, balanced home. The kid coming out of an economically depressed home has challenges that people who come out of financially healthy homes don't have. Now, obviously, you can go too far on the other side and you can actually handicap your child with too much. Right? And people don't realize that the earmarks of overindulgence look very much like the hallmarks of abuse. Because in two ways, if you're overly permissive with your child, it is a form of abandonment.
And they are the ones that get in trouble.
Right, because they've been abandoned to the wealth.
Wow.
Yeah. Right, because they have been. They've not had the boundaries and the instruction and the training that helps them know how to interact with others, that helps them learn when to put the filters in, that teaches them to be empathetic. Right, because you got to do that. And you have to, when you're wealthy, you need to understand that everybody doesn't have that. That is, in fact, privilege. And it's the lack of recognition of privilege that can sometimes be extremely abusive to others. Right? And I think back to things like my not being cognizant of what it was like for my African American passenger. I've told that story about being stopped on Highway 77, or almost stopped. We weren't actually stopped, and my not being afraid and him being terrified. And now I understand that completely, but at the time I was in my white privilege. Right, I was white female. No. And I understand a bunch of people who say Jews are not white. And that's that whole dynamic of... But
whoa, back up. What?
Well, because of discrimination, because of anti-Semitism.
Oh,
okay. So there are some things, right, no dogs, Jews, or actors allowed. Right? If we go back into, those were signs, right? Neighborhoods that you couldn't get into. That's why there were Jewish community centers, because Jews were not allowed into the country clubs. And now everybody goes to the Jewish community center because now it's just a great place to go.
Right.
And it has sports equipment and rental halls and all of the other things that community centers have. But the original reason for having those was a response to discrimination. It was like, if we can't get into the community one, we'll create one. And that worked. But, So we need to remember that there were things, and there were responses, and some of that ended up being strong and healthy, and some of it may not be.
Of course, I remember my mom talking about, of course, my grandfather was involved in the Italian purge in the movie industry back in teens and early 20s, and then there was a Jewish purge in Hollywood.
Yeah.
That he talked about, and that was,
So different groups get targeted.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And we live in a wonderful country that still has a lot of work to do. Right?
Work in progress. Right?
We are a work in progress. Right? We're celebrating women having the vote for 100 years, but not blacks. Blacks haven't come to 100 years yet, and won't for, unfortunately, a good number of years yet. And because it was 1965, folks. Not in all states, but in some states. That's when it became a federal law. And it's still being, people are intimidated. There's still all kinds of legislation done. And some of it's very subtle. Like there's a lot of states that make it harder, interestingly, for women to register. Why? Because women tend to vote Democratic. As a block. Well, I understand that. But here's the subtlety, and you might not catch it unless you're paying attention. If you change your name, then you have to have documentation to prove it. Who usually changes the name in a marriage? It's usually women.
Well, it's always women.
No, it's not always women.
Well, okay.
Okay. First of all, some women retain their name, right, and they're married with their earlier name. Other times, husbands and wives will actually come up with another name that's a blend of the two names, or there have been a couple of creative solutions, and it varies.
And then you have to get your driver's license.
Yeah, then you have to get your driver's license,
insurance, and everything changes.
So it makes it much harder for anyone who changes, and the bulk of the folks who change are women.
I never even thought of that.
No, most people don't. You don't think of that as being a discriminatory law, but in essence, it is. It has that effect. It makes it harder for women to get state IDs, especially for the states that now require photo state ID in order to vote. It's making it harder for women to register and then vote. So there's still a lot to be worked on. And certainly the laws could be easier and more flexible without the danger of voter fraud, right? Because this is not rocket science. You're not going to register twice with two different middle names. That's just not likely. So, yeah. So it's looking at some of these things, but until you really look at them and parse them down, just like the take into account, it's easy to translate it into a way that suits an agenda, right? And it's easy for the folks that are pushing this photo ID and rigorous, name change legislation and say, oh, we're just trying to make sure that the voters are who they say they are. There's a point at which it clearly is more than that. There's just,
Never even thought about that.
Well, and most people don't understand gerrymandering either, and how that shifts the voting in a state. And there's a whole lot of stuff.
I remember when I was a Capitol correspondent in Sacramento, and we actually were in a war room in the Cap with Governor Brown, and they were looking at maps, and this is what we want to do, and
because it controls the representatives, which controls what goes on, and it brings to mind from my old statistics days, back at
couple semesters
Goodyear, Goodyear. When I actually practiced the statistics, the popular thing that we used to say was that, figures never lie, but liars sure figure. Right? Because you can arrange things so that people get different impressions. And it's kind of interesting. So one of the courses that I'm teaching this semester is critical thinking, critical and creative thinking. And part of what people need to realize, and there's a great example in one of the videos that I'll be showing the students, which says that you buy a ball and a bat for $1.10, and the bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost?
10 cents.
No, because then it would be $1.20.
Oh,
right.
Okay.
But and that's the trick of the part of our mind that's automatic.
Okay, yeah, gotcha.
Right. So the real answer is 5 cents. The ball is 5 cents, and the bat is $1.05. Yeah. Oh, so easy. Okay, but and you're used to dealing with numbers.
Yeah.
Right, and you still fall into that trap. And yes, it's very definitely trapped. That's why it's got to be $1.10, because then your mind immediately goes
Oh,
$1.10.
sure. Yeah, well,
and it
naturally,
parses
yeah.
it. That's the automatic part of our brain. And and you think about it a few minutes later, and you go, of course it's 5 cents, right? But that's the conscious part of your thought.
Sure.
And that part in everybody is lazy. If it doesn't have to get involved, it often doesn't. And it's only when you force it through discipline or practice or something like that, that you keep forcing it to participate, that you get smarter and better at catching some of these little fallacies and tricks and plants and stuff like that. I love when there's a mentalist in the crowd, right? And the crowd's like, how did he know that she'd say red? Well, it's because he planted red in her mind, so that that would be the first thought that comes to her when he asks, pick a color, any color. He's been talking about cherries and apples and fire engines. Gee, let's be surprised that red comes into her mind.
Yes, sure.
Right, because we're visual creatures too. And mentalists are very good at looking at people, and they pick people that are, for lack of a better word, that they can read. That they, you can tell what they're thinking by what's on their face. And these are highly trained individuals who just know how to look for, the little squints in your eye and the way you hold your mouth and all of those unconscious movements that we make on our bodies. And if they can read somebody, then that's the person they'll pick out of the audience, because then they can see if their implant is working.
Wow.
Yeah.
I used to love that television show. As part of the Sacramento the state police, that they had a mentalist on the staff, and that was a great program. And you just think, and just as you say, they stare at people's mouths and can tell the various motions and stuff.
Well, and because people give away things, like if you're going to be aggressive, there are warning signs that people generally, once they decide to do something, there's a set to their face and to their posture, that those who know how to read those things know how to read them. And most of us just go through life doing what we do and don't think about it.
Yeah, I just kind of float through.
Yeah, and that's how most people operate. And so for the folks that are skilled at watching and looking, they can watch and read you. And one of the biggest places where science plays into our lives is in the supermarket.
Yeah.
Right. Supermarkets continually watch customers, and you'll see it with the BOGOs and the buy 3 get 1, buy 2 get 2. What they're trying to do is get you to fill up your basket. And over time, they've learned the things, and they keep sharpening it and checking it and sharpening and checking it. And I don't know if anybody's ever noticed it, but supermarket carts are getting, like, you need a crane to move them. They're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And
guilty as charged.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, what can I say?
I look for BOGOs.
Yeah, everybody does. Right. Even if you think you don't, you still look for sales, you look for this, you look for that. When I used to sell jewelry, the standard line was, 50% off. And during the 3 weeks out of the year that you had to have it at full price, you just figured you weren't going to sell anything. Right. And the rest of the time it went back on sale. And we all fall for that. And that's why they have to have a couple of weeks where it's at full price. But yeah, you need to be aware of what the real cost of things is. So that's part of what I do in some of these classes. And one of my fun experiments, or assignments, I guess I should say. It wasn't an experiment. It was for me, because I wanted to see how many students would do it and what they'd come up with. It was an extra credit assignment. But it was to see what GMOs are in your food. Right? So they had the list of GMOs, and of course we'd studied high fructose corn syrup. Mm-hmm. And we'd looked at the way that higher fructose corn syrup isn't labeled high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup has an upper limit, and if it has more fructose loaded into the corn, then they no longer have to call it high fructose corn syrup.
Ooh.
Yeah. they can come up with other, especially trade names. The food industry is just really over the top. And so it was an eye-opener to see, and I had a bunch of students who commented that they were blown away by what they discovered about the foods that they like to eat. Or you look at something, and it's got wheat flour, seminola flour. It's 90% flour, right? But they want to lower it down into the ingredients, so they break it up into component parts or things, or somehow, however they can figure out to break it up.
That's funny. Dr. Scheib was talking a little bit about that yesterday, and the Chinese. He said go back thousands of years and see what the corn husks and things like that. He said
they look totally different.
And that every piece of that corn was used for something.
Yeah.
Whether it was clothing or whatever it was, and it's kind of interesting. You think, okay, yeah.
So it's another thing that's really kind of interesting. One of the things in looking at history and in sociology and the development of cultures, we can tell when wheat gets cultivated, because it changes the way that the wheat grows. Wild wheat does not look anything like cultivated wheat. Wild strawberries don't look like cultivated strawberries. Strawberries are interesting. That's one of the few where the cultivated really is not nearly as sweet, but it's a lot prettier. The wild ones that were white were actually sweeter, but people liked red strawberries.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Huh.
So farmers have been changing food ever since we've been farming. And the more recent theory, it used to be that people thought that people congregated and then, they congregated in order to farm. But now what scientists are thinking is that as we came across into the upper Middle East area, coming across that land bridge, that's a place where animals can be domesticated for whatever reasons. The species of animals that live there are domesticatable, and it's a bountiful place for wheat and barley. Those two grains just grow abundantly there. And what scientists now think is that people came across these wheat fields and harvested them because they were ripe, and then they had more than they could carry, so then they had to build storehouses for the wheat. And having done that, they now had to guard it, because people who came later were like, well, give us some of the wheat. And since there was a perception of not enough, wars broke out. And people had to fortify in order to protect these stores. Well, once you camp and start storing stuff and guarding it, well, then you have to have year-round food. So then you have to start farming. And it's interesting to note that humans got shorter when we started to move into cities and farm. And people had to work longer and harder to have that food, but it was more secure. It was less varied, but it was more secure. So people gave up variety and health for security. It's an old theme. And then cities came, and city culture. And then eventually farming got to the place where you had an abundance, and then you could trade with somebody else, because you get tired of wheat and barley.
Sure.
So you want some frankincense and myrrh and different things that come from different places. And so trade routes start. And it starts to make
fascinating.
It really does make a whole lot of sense in that model. And then you can see, okay, so then these ideas travel or don't travel. Right? And look back to the biblical story of Abraham. Abraham comes down that land bridge, right? He comes out of Ur of the Chaldees. Ur is a word for city or light or something. But he comes out of some other part of the world and migrates down into what is called Canaan or Canaan.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so he's not a native. He's an immigrant. Yeah, we've had immigrants always, forever, everywhere.
Yeah. Interesting topic.
Yeah. What can I say, folks? The more we learn, the more we see that we repeat and repeat and repeat, and people are really pretty much basically the same. And it's fascinating to me because one of the other crazy things that I do is teach English to Chinese kids. And so we use a lot of pictures and hand motions because I teach exclusively in English. And, of course, in the beginning, they have no English. And as they get older, they get more and more English. But, facial expressions are the same. And, they can tell if an animal is happy or not. And,
How long, or I should say, what's the longest period of time that you've had with a Chinese student?
Well, the class is either 25 or 50 minutes.
No, but I mean as far as like
how long have
years.
I worked with? Years?
Yeah.
I've got a couple of students that I've been teaching now for 4 years.
Okay. Wow.
And so I've got some. Yes, I've watched. I've
Watch
watched
them grow
too.
Huh?
Yeah. Most of those kids
That's
are
cool.
Either in middle school or one or two are going into high school because depending on what level I pick them up at. I'm certified to teach anywhere from the pre-English, where they've got nothing and they just go and look at you, this like, boy, you look different from everybody I know, kind of look, right? Because that's part of it too, right?
You're not from here.
Yeah, I don't look Asian, so they've got to get used to a non-Asian correcting them and teaching them, and for some of them that's difficult, and I watch that.
Well, I never even would have thought that, but yeah.
Think of if you, whichever group you're in, if somebody outside that group starts teaching you and you live in a fairly homogenous culture where everybody looks a certain way, then somebody who looks very differently is, not only quote unquote the expert, but also the stranger, and how dare you, and so they've got to get over that. And, I found I have some really great friendships with their parents because, over 3 or 4 years, we've gotten to know each other a little bit, and they'll pop in or pop into the class.
So in the 4 years, how proficient are they?
Some of them have gotten really good. Some of them are really, really good. I've had some intense discussions about, is Paul Bunyan's clearly not true, but what's the real root of Johnny Appleseed, which is Johnny Chapman, right? Who sold apple orchards, not free apples, but so some of them are clever enough to do that. And there's a discussion about Christopher Columbus. They learn an interesting version of Christopher Columbus. They don't learn quite the crazy one that some American kids learn of. They learn, for example, that he didn't discover America. First of all, America was already populated, folks. But he also landed south of America. And that's actually taught to them, that he landed on an island south. And, I don't know how to describe it. The curriculum doesn't totally sugarcoat, but it also doesn't totally make clear everything that I wish it did about Christopher Columbus, because it's not all a good story by far. Certainly the natives in Hispaniola would tell you instantly that no, he was not a good person. And there's a little bit of that discussion, but not much. But it's more than I think most American kids get about Columbus, because when American kids start to learn the real story of Columbus, they're usually blown away and don't believe you, because they've gotten this little fairy tale.
Yeah, well.
Yeah.
It's the Disneyation of history.
Which is why this coming semester in my critical thinking, there is a Disney paper.
Oh, no!
I'll have to tell you more about that as the semester goes on.
Oh, no.
But they're going to get to find some of the stuff in Disney, because Disney tells quite a story in that animation about a lot of things. And we've raised whole generations on those movies, from Snow White.
Since the 40s.
Yeah, Snow White, right, who takes care of 7 dwarves. And what's her benefit in the world? She cooks and is quiet. She cooks, cleans, and is quiet. and it looks like a baby doll.
Mm-hmm.
Not a real woman, a baby doll. But the whole, that's a whole nother story.
Yeah.
We'll get into genderification because it's another fascinating story. And so, so you've got these 10 utterances and 10 commandments, like the one that's usually translated as thou shalt not kill. That's not what it says. This is thou shalt not murder. That's a whole different kettle. Because there's a whole lot of killing that goes on in scriptures, in wars and things. Yeah. It's not do not kill, it's do not murder. Thank you, translation. But then comes the next big question, which is what lawyers love. The very next couple chapters starts out by explaining, well, what is murder?
Taking of a life.
But it's a premeditated taking of a life.
Oh, I got you. Oh, yeah, sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Because the penalty for an accidental death, the penalty for a death that results from your being careless and thoughtless, and the death where you lie in wait, which is the definition of murder, should be different.
So how did they handle capital punishment back then?
Oh, they did. They had people who avenged those who were killed, and that's why they had cities of refuge. And somebody who was a premeditated murderer could be taken out of the city of refuge. Right, so it wasn't just a get home free kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah.
Right, murder was not tolerated, but accidental killing, you could go to one of these cities of refuge for a period of time, and you could make restitution in different ways. Not that you can ever replace somebody who's killed, because you just can't. But on the other hand, if it was really an accident, there's a different amount of punishment that should occur that's reasonable. And those are not easy questions. Those were not easy questions then, they're not easy questions now. And how do you balance the sanctity of life with the sanctity of life? Mm-hmm. Right? It was one of the more interesting pieces out of the Epstein piece that's happening now, and God knows what the truth is on that, and we'll find out. But one of the taglines that I thought was interesting was victims angry at lack of justice. What does that really mean? How do you really parse that? What's that about?
Well, that he didn't really get a day in court.
No, he didn't.
Them.
Right.
Or they didn't get an answer in a day in court.
Well, and the truth is they're never going to get an answer that they want.
Yeah.
They're never going to get the answer they want. And that's true with any situation like that. Now, on the other side of that, I've also seen people who've gone into court and find some satisfaction in having a case heard. There's just this full spectrum of stuff that goes on, but it all needs to be unpacked. It all needs to be whittled down, and the bottom line, I think, the real bottom line is what helps all of us have better lives. Is it reframing what we experience? Is it understanding better what we see? How do we improve the lot for all of us and not just some? And who's entitled to what? Those to me are really big questions that we've not even really begun to address. Dr. Seligman talks about happiness as a positive requirement for human beings. He was a former president of the APA. And positive psychology is a big part of what he brought in. And, he was teaching that we need to move forward to make our lives better and more positive. That it's not just, quote unquote, the pursuit of happiness, but in fact, that's part of it. And, what fills you up? I guess that's a way to put it, right? What makes you feel worthwhile? What makes you recognize that life is worth living for you and for everyone else around you? I think those are some of the bigger questions. And that's a perfect segue to talk a little bit more about Congregation Eitz Chayim. How's that for another segue?
Whoa.
Well, we're coming out of Tisha B'Av and moving into beginning to climb to the High Holy Day season. And that's a time of coming up to God, and it's a time for questioning some of these very things. That's not a get out of jail free card. That's a get out of jail by doing a heck of a lot of work, and owning your stuff. I always like to tell my congregants that there's good news and bad news. The good news is that if you really are penitent and do all the restitution, there's forgiveness there. The bad news is you got to do all that work and do the restitution and own it. Which means you got to own it. Yeah. You can't say, well, I did that last year. Why do I have to do it again? Clearly, you've got a lot to do if you think you did it all last year. You haven't begun to scratch the surface.
I'm okay, they're messed up.
Right, yeah, that's clearly not the answer, and it never will be and never was. It's not constructive. That's not a helpful paradigm. And that becomes the bottom line, is how do we help ourselves be more constructive, be more positive, be more building up rather than tearing down? And that means some individual tearing down inside yourself, and it means getting that little guy who thought that the bat was 10 cents more than the ball.
Yes.
To shut up for a minute and let the other part of our brain do some of the work. The part of our brain that's perfectly content to let the automatic do whatever it wants to do because it's so good at it, and not allow ourselves to be tricked into those things, to be not on autopilot, to be really mindful. And so, that's part of what we do at Congregation Eitz Chayim. We like to explore things not in a way that tears people down, but in ways that build people up. And we like to find joy. We like to find satisfaction at the greater good and with the greater good. So we like to do things that are into the community, that help the community. We've been part of some of the different, like Sarah's Kitchen and those things that are going around. And we have what we call Mitzvah Day, which is a day where we get together and do different things for the community. And we try to teach that to our kids, that we're not an island, we're not apart, we're part of the larger community, and we owe our existence and they owe their existence to each other. Right, everybody owes it to everybody else.
Got to pay it forward.
Got to pay it forward.
Yep.
And that's the way of really filling yourself up and making your community function in a happy way. So that's part of it. We're starting to explore that. We'll be doing Taste of Judaism, so watch for those announcements. I'll have the dates for you next week. There's a promise. And this is Rabbi Shafir Lobb of Congregation Eitz Chayim. Take a look for us on our website, www.eitzchayim.org, or look for us on University Boulevard, 540, Suite 102. And please check us out on Facebook as well. This is Rabbi Shafir Lobb for Congregation Eitz Chayim. This has been Ask a Rabbi. Easy for me to say.
You know, the one good thing
out
of this show is learning. And it's like you are our professor in this show. I love it.
Well, thank you so much. I love being a rabbi. I love being a professor. I love working with people. I love learning, and I love teaching.
There you go. This is WPSL, Port St. Lucie.